Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ray Gould, and I serve as Executive Director of NACI. It's a Native American Indigenous Studies initiative here at Brown. I joined just over 2 years ago, and it's been an exciting ride, I have to say. We're doing a lot of expansion. We're located at 67 George Street here on campus, and I am beyond pleased to have my two good friends, Michelle and Hartman, here this evening to share with you their incredible work. It's meaningful on so many levels. So welcome, enjoy the conversation, and I would also like to thank Makana Kushi from our office, our program coordinator. Please give her a round of applause. And Chadwick Crawford, a Native student here who is going to be basically leading this conversation. So thanks for your time and your effort towards this. So welcome and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Ray. So welcome, everyone. I am Avery Willis Hoffman. I'm the Artistic Director of the Brown Arts Institute, and I'm really excited. This is kind of our first live event and my first in my tenure as Artistic Director, and the Brown Arts Initiative became an institute over the summer. So we're really pleased that this is our first event and to have Michelle and Hartman with us, and also to say just many thanks to Ray and Makana and Sarah D'Angelo and other members of our kind of committee. We've been starting a collaboration that's really, really wonderful and meaningful, and I think this is the first of many, I hope, to come as we work together. And so just a few notes, just thank you for coming to witness and share and celebrate this really beautiful installation. It's called The Beads That Bought Manhattan, and it's on view in our Cohen Gallery, just up there until October 24th. So if you haven't seen it yet, please do go see it. And we will have a little reception after this where you can, I think it'll be open, right? Yes, okay. So the installation features the beautiful, beautiful work of Hartman Deetz, as you can see up there, and Michelle Cook, and the graphic panels were designed by Olivia Cook. And there's also film on view. So please, the gallery hours are Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 10, 8:30 a.m. to 10 p.m., and Saturday and Sunday, 12 to 6 or 12 to 8. So I'm going to turn it over to Chan right away, because I know we're having a wonderful conversation, but I just wanted to offer my thanks and gratitude for you all coming out tonight, and to everyone who's watching beyond these borders. So thank you. Chan.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chadwick Crawford. I'm a member of the Abenaki Nation Siskoy. I'm a second year here at Brown, and I am concentrating in international and public affairs. A little about my background also. I'm a founding member of the cultural organization Abenaki, which is dedicated to teaching and practicing Abenaki culture, and I'm also on the board of directors of Vermont's Indigenous Heritage Center. Now I will introduce our two special guests. Michelle Cook is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation and born of the Walk-Around clan. In 2015, Michelle received her Juris Doctorate from the University of New Mexico School of Law with a certificate in federal Indian law, and is currently a Doctor of Juridical Science. Candidate at the University of Arizona's Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. Her dissertation concerns the intersections of Indigenous human rights, divestment, and gender in the United States. Michelle has received major grants and fellowships opportunities, including a Fulbright Fellowship to study Indigenous justice and customary legal systems in Aotearoa, New Zealand. From 2016 to 2020, she served as a commissioner on the Navajo Human Rights Commission, established to collect data regarding discriminatory acts against citizens of the Navajo Nation. Michelle frequently engages in public advocacy and speaking. She is a founding member of the Water Protector Legal Collective, creating legal infrastructure for Indigenous peoples encamped in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline. She created an intersectional Indigenous-led divestment campaign, the Indigenous Women's Divestment Delegation to Europe, calling for European banks and institutions to divest from fossil fuels in support of Indigenous peoples' human rights. Her work has been featured in Reuters, and she has been interviewed by Glamour, The Guardian, and Cultural Survival International. She has also testified before UN bodies and representatives. Hartman Deetz is an enrolled member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Deetz has spent decades honing his skills in traditional Wampanoag arts, wood carving, stone carving, copperwork, featherwork, antler, bone, and wampum. Deetz learned from his family and tribal elders and artists such as Daryl Wixon, Brezzy Hendricks, Stuart Turner, Brian Bartebogue, and Bob Charlebois. Deetz worked in museum artifact reproduction and exhibits contracting, and is a powwow dancer who has made much of his own dance regalia. And now we will start the conversation. All right, hello. So, first, Hartman and Michelle, perhaps you could describe a little bit about the intentions of the Bead Set-Bot and Hand project, sort of what this spell is trying to the goals of the spell, what it's symbolizing, and yeah.
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Michelle Cook actually at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, and one of the very first conversations we had centered around wampum, as I brought wampum as gifts to all the panelists that night, and gifted her with wampum, and we started a conversation around wampum at the UN, and lo and behold, a few years later, we have produced, by her commission, the wampum belt to codify the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into a belt. I wanted to approach making treaties, new treaties, into wampum belts for Indigenous people, because I feel it's important that we are not simply relegating this process to the past. It's not something that's simply a means of recording our history, but something that can be useful to us as Indigenous people here and now, with a living presence, that we still have the power to exercise our self-determination and strike treaties and deals with other Indigenous peoples that benefit us and help move us forward. That's something that should be inherently within our rights. So I think the conversations, as we entered into them with Michelle around her work in international law for some of this project, I'll let you talk some to that as well.
Right. Well, yat she Michelle Cook Yanishie Hanagatni Nishlin Bilagana Basis Chin Bahi Dashich Bilagana Dashanale. My name is Michelle Cook, and I'm born of the One Who Walks Around You clan of the Diné Nation, and this is how I identify myself as a Diné woman. I'm so thankful to be here today. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as Indigenous peoples right now in the 21st century is the continuing legacy of racial stereotypes against Indigenous peoples. And we know that racial stereotypes, they basically enable certain populations to commit and justify and rationalize violence against a certain population. So with Indigenous peoples in particular, one of the enduring myths that has been propagated has been that Indian people are a group of people without laws, lawlessness, even Supreme Court decisions that have been handed down within our justice system that says, Indian people are with want of fixed laws. And so that ability to position Indigenous peoples as lawless enables a violence against our political systems. It erases our governing systems and our juridical personality as the original peoples of this land who govern, who have laws, just like anyone else. And so the treaty belt is to show and to educate American people and the world that Indigenous peoples have always had our customary laws. We've always governed ourselves by those laws. And really, what we want in the next century and now is to continue to be able to live, to have our laws and to be able to live by and to govern our territories and our people through those institutions. And the denial of our ability to self-govern, the denial of our ability to have law is an institution of racism. And so I think the Wampum Belt is an ability for us to educate not only about the existence of Indigenous peoples' laws throughout the world, but also to educate about our contemporary Indigenous human rights that are found within documents like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you. And so you've talked about like treaty belts and historical usage and something like that. So how would like wampum get used, years ago? Like, so was it like proof of like, you talk about lawlessness. Was it showing these laws, was it showing these, treaties and allyships and all that stuff? Were there other utilizations of wampum? In just a broad sense, sort of, was wampum always represented in that sort of sense?
So wampum is a beautiful material, for one. That's its first thing, is it's this gift from the sea that we get. It's one of the hardest shells in the ocean, and it has this beautiful purple and white grain. So we've used it for adornment, just for the natural beauty of it, for as long as it's been washing up on the beaches with us here, which is a pretty long time. But when we started to manufacture these beads into, not just a simple piece of adornment, but into patterns that carry messages, is when they start to take on, meaning beyond meaning. I was told that the shell of this being that we look at, it's a living being, and it's this living material, and some of these clams can live to be 500, 600 years old, some of the oldest living animals on the earth. And when we make these shell belts, or we make these shell weavings, we're able to tell these living beings our story. And they carry that story within them. And so this is a format that's completely indigenous of making records of memory. I explained it to some kids recently, talking to them about the idea of picture books. And if I showed you a picture of a big bear and a medium-sized bear and a little bear, and next to those bears was a girl with golden hair, you can instantly tell me the story. And part of that is because you've heard the story over and over and over again. Now with the one look at that one picture, you can recite the whole story from memory. And the wampum belts were the same way. They had pictographic symbols woven into them out of the purplest purple and the whitest white to make these high contrast images. And every time these belts were brought out, the story was told that accompanied that belt, and it was told verbatim. You had to tell it the way it was told to you. You didn't get to change the words of it. So I spoke about one of the Cherokee belts that's brought out in the film that helps them actually retain an older form of the language, because this verbatim necessity of telling the story exactly as it was told. And it's that repetition that really embeds that memory into these objects. And to be able to pull out this object and be able to look at this picture and have it bring you back to that story that you've been told 100 times before, 1,000 times before, means now you look at it and you can tell that story, because that reminds you of all the times you've been told. So through this mnemonic device, we were able to record our histories. Big significant events such as the Confederation of the Iroquois Confederacy is recorded in a wampum belt, and that's a part of a history. It's a treaty as well, but it's really a founding of a nation state. the other ways that these were used is as a seal, in a sense. You know, when the crowns of Europe might send an official word and communication, it would be sealed with wax and their official crest stamped into that wax. And then when people saw that, they knew that that word was official from the crown. And the same thing for our people. When a sachem or a leader might send word to a neighboring community or village through one of their messengers, they would send that messenger with their wampum belt to verify that this was not just a random message, but the actual official word from that leader to their village. So it served as a passport in a sense as well, or a seal of an official seal in a sense as well. It had a lot of different cultural uses, as well as recording treaties between different communities. So that's I guess a part of how it was traditionally used.
Okay. Was there something you wanted to say? Okay. So how did you choose the design of this one? What sort of things did you keep in mind when you sort of thought about the symbolism and the shapes and the colors?
Well, I mean, we had a limited palette, as we wanted to maintain traditional materials for the most part, or choose our particular new materials to incorporate with reasons behind them. And purple, white, and orange is the traditional colors that we have to work with here, conch being harder to come by in nice rich orange than purple is in the wampum, but still something that you can find. We talked and we discussed with elders and community members and people around about how to approach the design of this. And we came up with this after conversations, and you'll see on the ends on either side are double curves. And double curves are symbols that represent lots of different things that come to balance within our world. And you see them throughout the Algonquian-speaking peoples. These double curve designs are used. But that curve back in towards the center on each can represent the student and the teacher. Each one is a part of the other. The student sometimes is the teacher sometimes is the student. It can represent that natural balance of day and night, life and death, beginning and end. All these things that have that duality that create balance. And that balance is natural law. You can't undo it. You can't unwrite it. You can't write laws to take its place. There's nothing that we can do as human beings to change those things. So that's what encapsulates everything. If it doesn't sit within that, it can't exist. Beyond that, we have the two human figures. And they have the red conch bead in the center of their figure, and that's to represent the Wampanoag word for law, which translates to the voice that comes from within. And that's to acknowledge original law of the original jurisdiction of the actual people of the land. That has to be acknowledged. Otherwise, what is international law if some countries have the right to have laws and others don't? What does it mean if one country can impose their version of law on another? So to really have true international law, we have to be able to respect the law of the land. Everything else has to sit within that, otherwise it's meaningless. And then we have, it's upside down. And then we have the 46 beads on the field of white to represent the 46 articles within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And that's just one bead per article because it's lengthy, and to try to figure out how to way to symbolize each of those articles would have been too extensive of a project, really. And so we just chose to do it with one bead per article. We also included a blue stone bead, and that's to talk about how this system is imperfect because the UN still was founded in New York on unceded land that's contested by Native people. Their right to even claim the land underneath the building of the UN is contested land. So that's something we have to address, and that there are many imperfections within this system. It's one that's been largely put together and largely empowered by the colonial powers themselves. England and the United States and the colonial powers of Europe really had the largest say of how this was going to be structured, this body, the UN, was going to be structured. So we have to be able to address those things if we want to really escape the damages of colonization and be able to advocate for ourselves as indigenous people, as the colonized people. We have to be able to break free of that system. And that leads us to the three columns in the center, which have a dual meaning. For one, it incorporates abalone shell, and abalone shell being something that's sacred of the Diné people that is a part of what Michelle is bringing to the creation of this work as her conceptualization of that. I think it's important to include that. But those three abalone bands also represent the pillars of white supremacy that have to be undone in order for us to really realize our rights. That's racism, classism, and sexism. So in order to really realize our rights as human beings, we have to also address those issues as well. And to dehumanize us is a lot of times the process of colonization. And if it's by race, that's one way to do it. If it's by gender or by whatever else, these are all about dehumanizing us. So to regain our humanity, we have to overcome those things.
And would you say this is like the most complicated wampum project that you've had to work on?
Hands down, absolutely. Absolutely. I think everything else I've worked on, I may have taken a week of work on it, and this has taken 8 months to produce this piece. So.
How many people were involved with the whole process? Was it like a community process to gather materials?
I did the vast majority of the work, is the truth of the matter. We had an apprentice program through NACOB, North American Indian Center of Boston, where I took on 6 apprentices, and one injured their hand at work, so it ended up 7 overall. And I think out of those 7 students, I think maybe 5 of them contributed maybe 2 or 3 beads apiece, just to have a hand in it. And I appreciate those efforts for sure. And but the large majority of the work is done with these hands, and that's the truth of the matter.
You mentioned in your film also the importance of water in the construction of wampum beads. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, I mean, they come from the water, for one. Different bays have their different water quality, and the different bays have their different color quality. So if you need to get to the purple, you need to know what bay to find that purple in. Not all the bays have that same deep, rich purple. It's needed, and it's harder to find than the white. The white's easy to find. It's plentiful. Lots of times you open up a shell and it's just white. But to get that thick enough, deep enough purple, you have to go to the right pieces of water, which means knowing the water, which means understanding where those bays are, where you're going to get the quality shell. It's important in the process of actually making it, because the dust is full of silica, and if you breathe in that dust, it ends up coating into your lungs and creating scar tissue. But once it's trapped in water, it's harmless, because it's not poison, but it's if you breathe it in the air, you can die from it. So to keep that dust from getting into your lungs, to work underwater, where that water can capture that dust and keep it from getting in the air, is also super important. as well as keeping the shell cool so it doesn't crack and fracture as you try to drill it. So also help with that because the heat will crack it and fracture it.
And so how much labor goes into making one bead? Is it
I can now make about 20 a day.
20 a day? Oh.
Yeah, that's
I imagine that's taken a lifetime of practice to get up to that level. I've been making wampum for about 20 years. I've been making wampum in a focused sense for about 5 years. And yeah, it was the last 3 or 4 years that I've been making 2 beads to get up to that speed. So I guess all together about 20 years of practice to get there. Wow. And so, Michelle, you've focused on a lot of legal aspects of Indigenous rights. And so how does this sort of, how does creativity sort of influence activism? How has your legal studies sort of intersected with this sort of like artistic side?
I think, for me, the reason why I choose to do law is because I'm concerned with bringing change and to improve the lives of our people and the dignity of our people. That's why I choose to do law. So part of what I've also seen over the years is, Indigenous peoples throughout the world are fighting extractive industries, they're fighting fossil fuel companies, they're fighting for their lands and their resources, often from private industries. And as they're doing so, this new wave of criminalization and this new wave of repression is being perpetrated by state and non-state actors against any Indigenous person who dares to say, no, you don't have permission to come into my land. And so even the ability of Indigenous peoples to say no right now in the United States of America is a right that we don't have. And if we say no to a project or to natural resource development, like what's happening in Line 3 with the Enbridge Corporation, if an Indigenous person says no, they're criminalized and they're brutalized. And the state uses what Michel Foucault calls the biopower. It uses the force of pain and punishment to say, I'm going to force you through my police, through the state, through my imperial will, that you will submit to me by force, by violence. And that's what's happening to Indigenous peoples throughout the world. So if we cannot say no without being physically harmed by the state, if we cannot speak against a company without being targeted for some type of slander or libelous action, and that's another tactic that's happening now to silence people, is companies are attempting to silence Indigenous peoples through what's called strategic SLAP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation. So where are the spaces where Indigenous peoples and many people, where are the spaces left where we're able to speak freely without repression? And I think one of those remaining spaces of freedom is within the world of art and the imaginary and creation. And so, as a lawyer, I can talk about, the alternative realities that we should be making for our future. And in a legal audience, that might go over some people's heads. But as an artist, our job is to imagine a new and better world that doesn't exist. To create something that doesn't exist is our gift from Creator as human beings. And so the artistic world is that space for us. At this time, it's still safe, but we know that when push comes to shove, it's always artists and intellectuals that are also targeted when they speak too loudly. But for right now, in the United States, art and artistic spaces is still a place where there is public discourse. So I think art is a place where we're able to actually change law. You know, maybe law can be changed through artistic spaces and creative spaces. Maybe banging our heads against the Supreme Court is not getting us as far or as far enough in the time. It's not quick enough. So how do we mobilize the planet? How do we mobilize the planet? How do we mobilize human consciousness right now to wake up to the climate catastrophe that is waiting for us in 20, 25 years? So we don't have the time or the luxury or the privilege to only be speaking amongst lawyers and to lawyers with our legal language. We have to translate the needs of our people into a language in a medium that young people and all people can resonate with and can learn. And unfortunately, as a lawyer, that can be a very alienating field, but I don't think that art is. I think that art is very important. I'm thankful for this project.
No, art is so important. Would you say that like the expression of individuals with their cultures are like the best kind of, is it a good sort of protest against government failure to really take into the considerations of people? Would you say that this sort of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, what's different between its written form and this bill? Are there really differences? Are they exactly the same? How are things pervaded in this bill? The creative versus the just copy down.
Yeah, well, I think, what we're trying to do is to decolonize legal education also. So how do we take an instrument like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and put that in a context that is indigenous, into an indigenous framework? And so for us, that's creatively thinking how we do that. Well, what's a new way of understanding and learning about the Declaration? Well, what if we put it in a wampum belt? That's a new way of teaching about it, and it's a new way of providing a framework for understanding the UN Declaration itself. And that is really, like Hartman said, to create a foundation that is built upon the recognition of Indigenous peoples' original jurisdiction and law that existed before the UN was a sparkle in the eye and before the United States existed. So when we're able to put the UN Declaration within the context of imperialism, within the context of Indigenous liberation, it provides a different way of understanding and seeing where the UN Declaration has emerged from, and then potentially what are the future potentialities of a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But in terms of the belt, it is in some ways a actual representation in that there's 46 articles in the UN Declaration. There's 46 purple beads on a field of white. But I think, in how we tried to make this different was including the two almost infinity symbols on each side. And for example, in Navajo Nation, where I'm from, within our tribal court, we've codified some of our customary law. And one of those principles is Diné Behets Ani. And we use this law, and it's codified within our jurisdiction. So our courts and our judges use this law every day. And that concept is something that we call and say is something that is fundamental. So the original law that can't be changed, our relationship with water, our relationship with the natural world, those are relationships that were put down eons ago that we can't undo. And so I think having that story to begin and end the Declaration story is important, because we can't have our human rights if our original jurisdiction as a people's is continually denied by nation states, and that's exactly what we continue to endure as Indigenous peoples today. You know, I can consistently say that the Indian Wars have never ended, that they've only transformed into different modalities of economic exploitation and, you know, other forms of violence that may not look like a musket, but achieve the exact same goal of destabilizing our governing systems, destabilizing our existence as a political entity here in the United States with our own law and jurisdiction. And so that is essentially, you know, that contested power dynamic that has existed here for hundreds of years, is that we have a group of people who say their way is superior to your way. And if there is an issue, then the person who is ready to do the most violence, the empire, is going to commit violence to get their way. And that is the brutality that Indigenous peoples are still enduring. And so that's what I hope that the Belt can talk about, is how do we actually fulfill the human rights of Indigenous peoples in the United States of America. Because again, you know, the world looks to the United States of America. It looks to the Indian nations of this land as a standard of strength. So we have to stand strong here, as strong as we can, to set that standard of equity and equality, so that our brothers and sisters who are throughout the world who are struggling with more repressive regimes, so that they might be able to advance farther, so that they might be a little bit more protected. So here in the United States, we have to be strong. We have to assert our sovereignty by any and all means necessary, so that our people survive, and so that we can ensure our planetary survival for the 22nd century. And that means taking power away from those who don't deserve it. That includes banks and financial institutions. That includes non-state actors. There has to be a reckoning and an equalization of power between peoples and industry. And it's coming to a moment where we have to have these conversations in very real terms, because we are faced with a climate crisis. And there are people who are in positions of decision-making authority that have to change. And Indigenous peoples, because we have maintained biodiversity and we've maintained through stewardship our territories, we're one of the few societies that maintain a worldview of reciprocity with the natural world. And so Indigenous peoples' customary systems, our worldviews, right now are so important, because they offer that alternative to capitalism, to infinite financial growth at any and all means. That what we do is we're only interested in profit and expansion. There is no more room to expand without the decimation of the last remaining Indigenous peoples on this planet. And you can't expand without their decimation. So we're fighting for our lives all over the world, Indigenous peoples are, and we're hanging on to a thread right now. So it's incredibly hard, and there's a lot of Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, who are in danger all over the world, and so we really need to raise the alarm and do what we can to protect them, and to bring accountability to any kind of institution that is perpetrating or funding human rights abuses against them. So hopefully this belt can help us talk about some of those realities and uncomfortable truths.
You know, going through and researching some of the historic treaty belts, one of the things I was really surprised to come across was the Jay Treaty, which was a treaty between the early United States government and the Crown of England. And this treaty between the United States government and the Crown of England was actually recorded in Wampum, in a Wampum belt. And I think it speaks to the fact that this tradition, this legal tradition, was so ubiquitous in the States that this was just a part of international diplomacy if you dealt with international diplomacy within the United States, within the Americas. This was a part of diplomacy. This is how things were done. This was the legal tradition. Because here we have two powers that are not native governments, but yet there's this treaty recorded in Wampum because that's what the people of the colonies had become so completely used to. If you struck a treaty with somebody, you were striking a treaty with the native people, and if you struck a treaty with the native people and you didn't come through with Wampum, it wasn't valid. George Washington struck a treaty with the Iroquois and brought his wampum belt, and it was rejected as not being worth the value of the treaty that they struck. They sent him back to construct a new one, and he had to come back with a new, more impressive belt before it was accepted. So one of the things I hope to see, as well as all I certainly hope to underscore and see the things that Michelle talked about happen, but as well that to validate this legal tradition and to acknowledge that, as I had said earlier, that we still have these rights to pursue treaty and agreement between native tribes that are in our interest as a part of our self-determination and our sovereignty.
Yeah, and so you talk about this sort of cross-cultural, this sort of almost international effect of it. Where else do you want this? Where do you want this belt to go? Who do you want to see? Where should it be?
I think, one of the problems with wampum belts is that a lot of them end up in museums. And some of these museums are not very accessible to either the public or accessible to indigenous peoples. And so I think one benefit of making a modern treaty belt based on the UN is that we're able to actually have possession of that and take it to people. I think some of the most incredible experiences we've had has been with young people, but also with older people. We've had older Wampanoag people see the film and really have a new appreciation for their culture and for what wampum means. And we've also had young people who've watched the film and who've seen the belt and who've seen their family members in the film and who are really proud that they know someone in a film, right? And that they're like, that's my uncle. I know that guy. That's my uncle. He's in the film. He helped do that wampum. So it also gives young people that self-pride and that self-confidence so that, anytime we can bring up that, anytime we are affirming our culture as Indigenous peoples, we're also affirming our self-esteem and the self-esteem of our young people. And when we have the confidence in our identity and who we are as a people, then anywhere we go, we're in a better position of knowing and of peace, really, and security with who we are, because we know who we are. We know our history and our identity. So when we teach this, it gives people a place where they're able to situate themselves into the world and find a home and a place. So it's about reestablishing our relationships also with one another and the natural world too.
One of the things I would love to see, and part of what I was really excited about when I was first, when the discussion first came up about making it, is that, well, I come down from Blind Joe Amos, a Wampanoag preacher, who helped really secure a lot of rights for Wampanoag people by challenging the community to treat the people of Mashpee with Christian dignity, and held them to the standards of the Bible. And he found that he couldn't advocate for us to be treated as equal under the law, but he could advocate for us to be treated equal as Christians. And part of how he did this was he was able to gain control of our meeting house by using the original protest of Martin Luther, that the people would be preached to in their own language. And he did this because he had memorized the entire Bible, both in English and in Wampanoag. So he memorized the Bible. He knew it forward and backwards. He knew the whole thing. And that when this belt is something that's presented, it's encoded with this, and to be able to remember that from forward and back would be, a way of knowing this legal system so completely that it's, to be a living book. And I'm hoping that Michelle can pass this knowledge on, this amazing amount of knowledge on, to legal students,
and non-legal students too. I think the good thing about a belt, instead of me dragging a case book to someone, and I don't know if you've ever seen some of these case books, they're not small books. Either they're intimidating, and I think the whole legal profession is built in a way on intimidation and power and exclusion. So if we're able to bring in a belt and say, I'm going to teach you international law using this belt, and here, you can pick it up, you can be an expert on international law, on the UN Declaration, and you don't need to go to do an LSAT, you don't have to go to a bar, you don't have to ask anybody's permission to be an incredible advocate, history maker, future maker, innovator for your people. You don't need to have a Western legal system to validate your indigenous vision of law and justice. And as a young person, you don't have to wait until you are a licensed lawyer at the bar to make incredible legal changes for your people. So I think that's important, and hopefully, we'll be able to see it in law schools. In law school environments where lawyers can learn about international law using that way, and outside of legal environments where young people can learn also.
Yeah, and if you could sort of do something like this project again, are there any other specific declarations or rights or anything else that you'd especially also want to sort of show or reconstruct with wampum or another indigenous medium? Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, I think, right now there is a growing awareness of an epidemic of violence against Indigenous women and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I know recently a lot of people have heard about the incredibly unfortunate situation and murder of a young woman in the state of Wyoming. And indeed, we all know about that unfortunate case, and there was a lot of resources used to locate this young woman. However, in the same state of Wyoming, there's about, I think the last number we saw was about 800 to 900 Indigenous women that are missing and murdered. And we have not heard their name. They have not received the same amount of support. Their families haven't received the same amount of resources to locate our lost relatives. And so I think, if we did do this in the future, that is a topic that we would like to focus on, is preventing violence against women and preventing violence against the earth.
Yeah, there's I got to work with I don't know more San Francisco Bay Area when I was out there for years, and there's a number of that group members that are signatories of the Indigenous Women of the Americas Defending Mother Earth Treaty, and that's a completely it's a treaty between indigenous people, completely imagined, created, conceptualized by indigenous people, and it's one of mutual support between indigenous people across across national lines across the Americas, and so that's something I think would be great to see encoded into a belt, and that'd be the next project that I would like to take on with Wampum.
Yeah. So, is there anything else you'd like to add? You've already talked a lot about the main things that you want to convey with this belt. Is there anything else you want to sort of bring up that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I think what's really critical in the belt that we're also trying to uphold is the rights of indigenous peoples to explore their own economies. And part of the destabilization and the genocide against indigenous peoples has always been an attack on indigenous peoples' economic systems and the destruction of those economic systems. And so part of what we also want to highlight with this belt is that indigenous peoples have the right to develop their economies and their economic structures. And it's incredibly important now that we envision alternatives to capitalism. And so if indigenous peoples have the right, as stated in the Declaration, to develop our economies as peoples, then we should be able to develop them, if we want, with capitalism, or if we want to create another system, then we should have the self-determination to create an economy that we consent to and that works for us in our relationship with the earth, and with our worldview. And so I want the realization of our right to our economic rights. I want those also to be realized. And I think, because we've been so conditioned to only imagine and see an economy through capital and through profit and through that Western system, we've completely lost our imaginations on how we could organize an economy any other way. And we have to reorganize our economies. We have to reorganize our relationship to the earth, and it has to translate into fiscal changes. And so that's also part of what I hope comes across with the belt. But it has a lot of different meanings, and all the different articles in there. We can talk about language, we can talk about economic rights, we can talk about gender, we can talk about land rights, and so it gives us a very large palette to draw from for many different rights.
Yeah, I noticed that in the name, the beads that bought Manhattan with this project. I imagine you've encountered sort of this general idea that wampum is just like money; it's just trade. How have you sort of been fighting that? What are some things that you've sort of come across that you've sort of tried to overcome? And how has that sort of been along the process?
Well, I think it's also fighting against the trivialization, right, of wampum. It was at one point circulated as a currency. It was a means of exchange. It was a medium that held multiple messages and multiple potentials. And so I think bearing that in mind is incredibly important because it shows that we have a counter story, that we have a counter narrative to that dismissive stereotypical way of viewing Indigenous peoples. Because as long as we just view it as, oh, that's just wampum, those are just trinkets, you know, that we lose that diplomatic meaning, we lose that cultural meaning, we lose the law that is embedded even within the harvesting of the shell, right? So right from the time you harvest that, you're engaging within customary legal systems. To the moment of how you bring it to a community, how you make an agreement, all of that is built on customary norms, and so we're challenging a stereotype that is 3,000 years old, and that stereotype found its origins in Greek and Roman civilization, so-called civilization. That's where the myth of savagery really came from and became an energizing force. And if you look back at the Iliad, you know, or the original works of Homer, right, the so-called foundations of Western civilized thought, one of the reoccurring tropes is that the savages are drunk, they are without law, they don't wear clothing, and those are all the reasons why we have the right to go to them and change them, if by force, because they are defective human beings. They are non-normative. We've been cast as non-normative. So anytime we're engaging with wampum, we're fundamentally engaging and deconstructing and challenging a process that is committed to our dehumanization. Because if we're dehumanized, then it's okay to harm us and take our land. So as long as we can get people to see the humanity of Indigenous peoples, then we do a lot to challenge that culture of violence.
Yeah, one of the things that we see with the indigenous economies was barter and trade, but also it was very much an economy built on reciprocity. So you see again and again through colonial records, the local community that's helping them out might show up with some abundance of gifts, and the colonizers take those gifts and are very pleased with those gifts. And weeks go by and months go by, and the native community comes back very upset and hostile. And the colonizers can't figure out why, and it's because they didn't reciprocate those gifts. And that spirit of reciprocity is something that's lacking in a monetary exchange. I can buy a soda and I can dump it out on the ground, and what does it matter? It's my soda. But if there's a reciprocity that's involved, where you're supposed to show that you're grateful for what you've been given by giving back, then to dump that soda on the ground is not all right. You know, to be wasteful with that, to not show an appreciation for what you've been given. And with wampum, I mean, it was valued because, you know, a single bead might take a day of labor to produce. And, you know, this necklace has got, I think, maybe 60, 70 beads on it, 2 months of work. If you wanted to trade for that, you want something of high value. You want something that valued that, you wanted the reciprocity that valued the time and effort that you put into that. So, you know, with that, there's, of course, value that was put in it, but the idea that it's just a number, or that, you know, the way that you treat things when you buy things it's just not built in. And when they talk about Manhattan being bought for a string of beads, and they treat us as if it was so cheap and that we were foolish to be able to, oh, those foolish Indians, they just took a string of beads for an island, they don't know what it's worth. It ignores the fact that this is not just an exchange of, you know, done deal. It's an entering into an agreement of reciprocity. It's entering into an agreement of relationship with the communities around you, with the land itself. And this is an agreement that carries obligations of stewardship and caretaking and all these other things that are built into a reciprocal economy rather than a cash economy. And wampum had that value of that reciprocity into it. It had that value of that relationship that was built within it, that value of that living being that carries the story of the agreements that you made as witness. Cash didn't have that. Cash lacked the power to buy into land agreements because it didn't have that reciprocity built into it. It didn't have the obligations, the relationships, the agreements that came with it. So you couldn't come to the Americas and buy land with gold and coins because it didn't have the value that wampum did.
Yeah. And so when you talk about this reciprocity, would you say that the UN Declaration, has that really produced, tangible results? Is this, I think that's maybe a contentious question, but have you sort of seen anything that's sort of where it has really made an impact in other areas?
Well, I think the UN Declaration is incredibly important because it's a standard-setting instrument within international law that outlines roles and responsibilities of states and non-state actors and how they engage with indigenous peoples. So the UN Declaration is incredibly important because it provides, a common language that we can all speak with respect to the rights and the needs of indigenous peoples. But again, we are not at the point of fulfillment and implementation of the UN Declaration. So we have a declaration, it's been passed, it's been adopted by all the nation states at this point. But what we don't have is the operationalization. What we don't have is the implementation of the rights that are set in. So a very simple right is the right of free, prior, informed consent, that indigenous peoples have the right to give or to withhold consent to activities that are occurring within their traditional homelands or lands they've otherwise used or occupied. And so we still don't have that right here in the United States right now. And so it's not that different from, the 18th, 17th, 19th century. In terms of how far have we actually in fact advanced. But irrespective of that, indigenous peoples, we have to start somewhere. We have to make the steps and the inroads where we're able to. And so the UN Declaration is a victory. But like we've said, and like we have articulated with that blue bead, just because we have that declaration does not mean the work is done yet. In fact, if anything, now is when the work starts. How do we keep the state accountable for the agreement that it's made to indigenous peoples and to the world? And so we're still fighting very much for the realization of those rights. But I'm hopeful that as we continue to educate people, as we have more access to information, that we're able to educate people about imperialism and about colonization, and that we're able to change that bad habit within the minds and imaginary of the Western world so that it no longer sees indigenous peoples as a frightening other, as a beast or a savage along some kind of unknown edge of an empire, that we are brothers and sisters and relatives, that we share this earth together, and that there is no other, there is only we, that it's all of us together here. And so that's what a lot of those original belts that were created by indigenous peoples held, that knowledge. There's a belt called the one bowl, one spoon belt. And that belt teaches people that, you know, that we share the earth like one bowl, and that no one gets to take everything, that no one person gets to control the spoon and take it, and that no one else gets to eat, that everybody shares in the bowl, and that we have to share the spoon from this bowl that is the earth. Those agreements, that law is just as valid as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The legal knowledge that Indigenous peoples have already encoded within their belt, I would say, is one of the most advanced forms of relationship. Because, right now, Indigenous peoples, we say, you know, the earth has a right, that Mother Earth, there's rights of nature. But that's still considered almost a radical position, to think that we can give legal personality to rivers or to mountains to protect them. Yeah, I think that we still have a lot to go, a long way to go.
Yeah, we can't seem to find legal personhood for a river, and yet we can find legal personhood for Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a legal person, and that eats money and doesn't breathe air. This idea that you can give personhood to a corporation and not to a living, breathing, natural feature of the world is certainly, I think, emblematic of the problems we have in this society today.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you both so much for coming here, for making this, incredible piece of incredible wampum belt, and for talking to me. And I want to thank everybody for coming here also and listening. And I invite everybody also to move upstairs to the Cohen Gallery and lobby for light refreshments and to celebrate the exhibition of the beads of Manhattan. Do you have any final remarks?
No, just thanks, Brown. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Ray. Thanks, everybody, for bringing this all together and putting it together and making it happen. Definitely honored to be able to take part and share my work with y'all.
Absolutely. It's an honor and a blessing to be alive, and it's an honor and blessing to be able to have been able to work with Northeastern Indigenous peoples and the Wampanoag people to be able to get a glimpse into this world, this very sacred world. So I'm incredibly honored and indebted to Hartman and his family for carrying on that tradition. And I feel like I'm just here to help tell that story. And to hopefully give more of a platform for this conversation to happen. And so thankful for everyone here that helped us to get here today too. Thank you.